On the morning of Monday, January 7th, 1985, a 31-year-old man arrived at an international airport in order to board his flight to the United States. The man was very nervous. His heart was beating fast and his palms were sweating so much that he could barely hold the handles of his very heavy, tan-colored suitcase. And the reason he was so nervous is because he was feeling very conflicted about what he was about to do. On the one hand, this trip was something he'd been dreaming of for months, and it was supposed to represent the start of a great brand new life. Now, this man hadn't actually packed very many personal items to take with him. But one thing he had brought was a little bound book full of photographs, which showed what mattered the most to him. And what mattered the most was waiting for him in America. But on the other hand, the man was terrified, because before he could begin this brand new life, he had a huge problem he needed to take care of. And that problem was why he needed to drop off his very heavy suitcase without anybody looking inside of it. And so now, inside the airport, the very nervous man stopped and readjusted his grip on the suitcase handles, and then made his way over to the ticketing area, where he would check his bag for his almost 11-hour flight to California. And then, once he touched down and they landed in California, he could get off the plane, go to the baggage carousel, and get his luggage, and then everything would be fine. Now, of course, he knew this was a big gamble. If it had been possible, he would have just brought this bag with him on the plane to stow it in the overhead bin, but he just couldn't do it because the bag was too big, too heavy. And so really his only other choice, if he wanted the suitcase to make it to California, was to check it like he was doing, because the alternative was leaving it behind, and there was no way he was going to do that. He cared far too much about what was inside of this luggage. And so by the time the man actually got in line in the ticketing and baggage check area, he was so stressed out that he was beginning to feel physically ill. By the time he got to the front of the line, he still felt very sick, but he composed himself enough that he walked up to the counter of the airline he was traveling with, which was Lufthansa Airline, and the employee who was working behind the counter was very cheerful, and they greeted the man and took his passport to verify his information. Then the employee put down the passport and then reached out his hand and gestured for the nervous man to give him his very important suitcase. This was, of course, the moment the man had feared the most, when everything could really go astray. But as calm as he could, he lifted up the suitcase, and for a second he almost panicked because it was just so obviously heavy. He realized the employee might make him open it right there because it just seemed wrong that this suitcase was that heavy. And he knew if that happened, he was done for. He'd be arrested immediately. But instead, the employee just dragged the heavy suitcase over to a conveyor belt behind the counter, and the nervous man watched as the employee heaved the suitcase onto the belt, and the man kept his eyes locked on the suitcase as it rolled down the belt and then disappeared through a pair of rubber flaps at the very end. He was so focused on the bag, he almost didn't notice the airline employee returning to try to hand him his boarding pass for the plane. Finally, the employee literally just waved the ticket in the man's face to get his attention, and it kind of snapped him out of it, and he took the boarding pass, and as calmly as he could, he thanked the employee, and then he turned and hurried off to catch his flight. About 12 hours later, on the other side of the world, another employee of Lufthansa Airlines walked around the baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport, which is typically just called LAX. It was about 2 p.m. Los Angeles time, and the employee was working in the international terminal. It was his job to monitor the circular carousels where passengers picked up their luggage after their flights, and his job was to make sure no bags were left behind. And as he was making one of these loops, he noticed there was a tan-colored suitcase with soft sides sitting all alone on one of the carousels. The employee stopped and checked the monitor above the carousel to see the last time this carousel had been used by an incoming plane, and it was quite a while ago, and all the passengers clearly had come through and picked up their luggage, except for this one lone bag. So, based on the timing, the employee figured that, this bag must be unclaimed. But this was not remotely concerning to him. Luggage went unclaimed all the time. Sometimes because bags were sent to the wrong airport, or because the suitcase's owner missed their flight, or even just forgot to get it. But whatever the reason was, it was this employee's job to simply start the process of identifying the owner of the suitcase. So, like he always did, he walked over to the carousel and grabbed the suitcase handle and went to pick it up. But when he did, he let out a sort of surprised grunt and stumbled, because the suitcase was so much heavier than he had expected. So he went back and he grabbed the handle with a better grip this time with 2 hands and braced himself and yanked, and the suitcase kind of toppled over and fell off the carousel onto the floor. And this was also around the time that the employee noticed that this really heavy suitcase had no tags on it. And so now this bag did seem very unusual. The extreme weight and no tags, that's not normal. So he knelt down and he began to unzip the suitcase to see what was inside. He was legally allowed to do this because unclaimed bags at airports are subject to search. But he had only unzipped it a little bit before he froze, and for a second he just stared in shock at what was inside of the suitcase. But then he immediately got to his feet, just left the bag there, and ran to go find a phone to call the police. A little less than 2 hours later, around 3:45 p.m., Detective Don Ravens of the Los Angeles Police Department's Pacific Division stood in the baggage area of LAX's International Terminal, looking down grimly into the tan suitcase that was lying open on the floor. He was surrounded by officials from the LAPD, as well as the FBI, who had all been called to the airport because of what was found inside of the suitcase: the dead body of a young woman. Detective Ravens was shocked. He guessed this woman was maybe less than 30 years old, and judging by her features and dark hair, he thought she could be from an Asian or Latin American country. But that was about as far as he could get, since she didn't have any identification with her, and there were no tags on the bag. There were also no obvious wounds on her body, so he couldn't immediately tell how she died. Ravens spent some time speaking to airline and airport employees, including Customs, which is the government agency that's in charge of inspecting bags that are coming in and out of the country. And he was puzzled as to how a suitcase with a body inside of it had somehow cleared customs, but an agent explained that they didn't actually open up all the suitcases, which meant whoever checked this bag through customs had taken a huge risk, because realistically, they could have been searched and then the body would have been found. So this suggested a certain level of desperation, but apparently this risk this person took to check the bag had paid off because the bag had gone all the way to California. But despite that, Ravens didn't find much to go on here. At this moment, the victim was a Jane Doe, which meant there was no identification for her. And Ravens knew she could really be from anywhere in the world, despite, his snap judgment that perhaps she was from an Asian or Latin American country. And because LAX was an international airport, whoever checked this bag and potentially even put her into the suitcase could now be anywhere in the world too. Once Detective Ravens and the other investigators had finished examining the body as it was found inside of the suitcase, they didn't actually pull her body out. They sent the suitcase and her body to the coroner. Hopefully, an autopsy would turn up evidence that could tell Ravens and the other investigators who this Jane Doe was and what happened to her. The following day, on Tuesday, Ravens sat down at his desk and he opened up a manila folder he had been given. Inside of it was his Jane Doe's autopsy report. And when the detective began reading it, he couldn't help but feel sick, because what he was reading told him that this poor woman had died a horrible, torturous death. The report said the woman had bruises all over her body, like the kind you would get from repeated heavy blows delivered over a period of at least several hours while she was still alive, and her actual eventual cause of death was ultimately suffocation, which meant she either was suffocated and then put into the suitcase, or was in the suitcase, trapped inside of there, and suffocated. Ravens put down the report and leaned back in his chair and just sort of thought through what he had just learned. Based on the autopsy, he now knew this poor woman had died a brutal, awful death, but the coroner had not found any identifying information or anything on her that would give away or help to give away who she actually was, or who did this to her. So really he had very little here, other than knowing this lady suffered. Ravens had spent the last 24 hours poring over all the surveillance footage from the airport security cameras, looking for any suspicious passengers leaving without any luggage. But nothing had jumped out at him. He had also interviewed a bunch of airport employees who would have been in the baggage claim area on the day the body was found, but none of them had noticed anything strange either. And so, despite it only having been one day since this woman was found, Ravens was already worried that this case was going to go cold. But what Ravens had not counted on was the huge amount of publicity his Jane Doe would generate. The TV news, as well as the newspapers, were reporting feverishly on the body that was found in the LAX suitcase. And by Wednesday, so 48 hours after the body was found, the reporting had made it all the way to Peru, where a man named Juan Espinoza contacted authorities to report that the body might actually belong to his wife. Officials in Peru called the LAPD, and Juan's report ended up on Raven's desk. Ravens opened up that report and began reading. Juan and his wife lived in Peru's capital city of Lima, but his wife had been trying to leave Peru to escape poverty. She had left their home hoping to basically sneak into the United States so she could get a job there and then send money back to her family in Peru. She had promised Juan that she would contact him when she arrived in America, but after she left, Juan said he never heard from her. This report felt like a promising lead to Ravens. Juan and his wife checked a lot of boxes, especially because, Raven's Jane Doe had features that indicated she could be from a South American country like Peru. And so Ravens wondered if Juan's wife had tried to get into America by using a human smuggler, which is someone who transports immigrants across borders illegally. Human smuggling was obviously an unregulated industry, and Ravens knew smugglers could be very violent or reckless, and the people they were transporting often had no protection. Meaning, sometimes when people would go to these smugglers to try to get help to go to these other countries, sometimes the smuggler wouldn't help them. They would just rob them, or in some cases, rob them and then kill them and dispose of their body. And unfortunately, again, because there's no regulation or oversight, a lot of times these horrible crimes would just go unnoticed. And so maybe if that's what had happened to Raven's Jane Doe, it would explain why the tags were ripped off the suitcase. The smuggler who, committed this crime would not have wanted to leave any ID on or around the body that could be traced back to them. And so Ravens picked up his phone to call the LAX airport operations manager to see if he could get the logs for any flights coming from Peru to LAX on the day the body was found. And that was when he discovered there was a big problem with this theory, because there were no flights from Peru. The only flights that day that used the luggage carousel where the body was found were from Korea, Japan, and Germany. And there weren't any flights that originated in Peru that had layovers in those countries either, which meant it just wasn't possible that his Jane Doe was Juan's wife. And so now Ravens was stumped all over again. He had almost no evidence to go on. All he really had was the suitcase and the body. And the actual crime scene itself was maybe somewhere in Korea or Japan or Germany. And so Ravens really didn't have a good idea of where he should begin looking for more evidence. But then he got an idea. Detective Ravens got up from his desk and headed straight to the evidence room. He put on a pair of disposable gloves, and he found the box that contained evidence from Jane Doe's case, and he opened it up. And there really wasn't much. All that was in there were, pieces of jewelry and some clothing that were found on the woman's body. And all of it had already been examined for trace evidence like blood or hair. However, blood and hair were not what Ravens was looking for. One at a time, he lifted out each of the sealed plastic bags that contained Jane Doe's belongings until he got to her blue sweater. He took the sweater out of the plastic and he turned it over in his hands and then checked inside the neckband. And there he found exactly what he was looking for. Immediately, he felt a rush of adrenaline. He was onto something here. And so he reached back into the box and he grabbed another plastic bag with a pair of gray pants in it. And he did the same thing. He looked at the waistband. Then he opened a third bag and he checked inside of her blouse. And each time, his hunch had been right. Jane Doe's clothing had labels sewn into them, and the labels were clearly written in some language that was not English. Ravens wasn't sure, but to him, he thought maybe the letters looked Middle Eastern. It didn't take long for the FBI to help Ravens and the LAPD identify the origin of Jane Doe's clothing. All of it had been made in the Middle East, in Iran. This meant that finally, Detective Ravens had a likely country of origin for his Jane Doe. But he also had another problem now. Really, he had the same problem he'd had when he thought his victim was from Peru. And that was that there were only 3 international flights that his Jane Doe could have been on. And none of them originated in Iran. And there were no connecting flights from Iran that day either. And so Ravens needed the public's help. On Thursday, so 3 days after the body was found, he and another detective sat down with a reporter from the city's newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, a publication that's read all over the world. And Raven and this other detective's goal was, to give as many updates as they could about the case, hoping that somebody somewhere would read the story, recognize a detail, and come forward. However, that's not really how the interview played out. By the end of it, Ravens was feeling pretty discouraged by all the questions he and his partner just couldn't answer. In fact, the last thing he said to the reporter, which ended up getting printed as the sort of last line of the story, the lasting impression, if you will, was, "Don't be too surprised if you never find out where she came from or who she is." The next morning, Detective Ravens got to his office and had barely taken off his coat when his phone rang. A police officer from Sacramento, California was on the other line, and he sounded all worked up. He told Ravens that he knew that, the LA investigators had been working on the airport Jane Doe case, and even though it wasn't going anywhere, he knew it was a big deal for them. But he told Ravens that he actually had this unbelievable development in Northern California that was connected to the airport Jane Doe case. He said authorities in Northern California had just found another body. But when Ravens heard this, his first reaction was not excitement that there was new evidence or something. It was confusion. He didn't need another body. He needed to find his Jane Doe's name. And so he asked the Sacramento officer, what he meant. Had they found another woman in another suitcase or something? But the Sacramento officer said no. The body belonged to a man, and this guy's name had never even been on police radar. He had died from a gunshot wound, 400 miles away from Raven's Jane Doe, but the officer said that the story they had uncovered behind this new body would likely solve Raven's Jane Doe case. This is the story that the Sacramento officer told Ravens. On the evening of Monday, January 7th, just a few hours after Jane Doe's body had been found at LAX, a man named Hadi had picked up his friend and roommate, a 31-year-old man named Mahmoud Ayazi, at the Sacramento airport, which is about 400 miles north of LAX. Hadi was excited to see Mahmoud, who'd been away for a few weeks. They were good friends, and Mahmoud was always very optimistic and fun to be around. But on this day, when Mahmoud got in his car, Hadi immediately noticed that his friend seemed sullen and quiet, and just very clearly upset about something. And so Hadi asked him what was wrong. And Mahmoud just said, I'm sick with the flu. But to Hadi, Mahmoud did not look very sick. He looked worried and kind of jittery and nervous. And as they started to drive, he kept looking out the windows and out the back of the car, like he was nervous about somebody following them or something. And when they got back to their apartment, Mahmoud went straight to bed. And for the next 2 days, Mahmoud continued acting increasingly weird and paranoid. He asked Hadi to disconnect the phone in their apartment and said he didn't want to see any of their mutual friends. He also kept looking out the windows of their apartment, but whenever Hadi asked what was wrong, Mahmoud refused to explain. Then, sometime before 6 a.m. on Thursday morning, so now 3 days after Hadi picked Mahmoud up from the airport, Hadi woke up to the sound of the front door of his apartment opening and then shutting. So it felt way too early for Hadi or Mahmoud to be up, and they also lived in a city where break-ins were unfortunately not uncommon. So the sound of the door opening was enough for Hadi to get out of bed and go make sure everything was okay. But when he got to the door, he did not find an intruder or something. He found Mahmoud in the process of leaving the apartment. Hadi asked his friend, where are you going? But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was simply going out. And so there was really nothing Hadi could do. He couldn't stop Mahmoud from going out, so he watched his friend leave, and then Hadi went back to bed. But as he was in bed, he had this sick feeling in his stomach that something bad was about to happen. About 2 hours later, somebody called the Sacramento Police Department to report finding a dead body in the driver's seat of a car in a parking lot. The dead man had clearly died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and on the passenger seat next to the body were 2 Iranian passports and 1 Lufthansa Airlines plane ticket. When the Sacramento police officer finished telling Detective Ravens the story, he said he believed that one of the passports that were found in the car with the body belonged to Raven's Jane Doe. He said he would send it over that afternoon by courier so Ravens could make a positive ID. And when the passport did arrive, Ravens was able to finally give his Jane Doe her name back. She was a 20-year-old Iranian woman named Katan Safawi. And after investigators searched Mahmoud's apartment, they would find another piece of evidence that would actually explain why Katan Safawi had ended up beaten and pummeled and asphyxiated to death in an abandoned tan suitcase in LAX. The evidence was a little bound book, and it was full of photographs. Back on January 7th, 1985, Mahmoud very nervously dropped off the tan suitcase that contained Katan at the international airport and then boarded a Lufthansa flight to LAX. He was traveling from Frankfurt, Germany, one of the 3 cities that had flights into LAX that day that specifically used the carousel where the body was found. But Mahmoud's trip had not started in Frankfurt. It had started in Iran. But his travel plans had gotten all messed up, and he'd gotten stuck in Germany for several days. And so this was him finally getting out. But he was insanely nervous about this leg of the trip because of what was in his suitcase. He had expected to feel much less worried once he had successfully checked the suitcase and got his ticket and boarded his flight. But when he did all that, and when his plane took off, Mahmoud only got more and more anxious. Every time the plane hit even the tiniest amount of turbulence, he wanted to scream from the anxiety. But finally, the flight landed at LAX, and as soon as it touched down, Mahmoud got off as fast as he could and practically sprinted to the baggage carousel where he would pick up his suitcase and then board another flight to Sacramento. But when he got to baggage claim and he picked up his suitcase, he knew immediately something was wrong. With a shaking hand, he unzipped the suitcase. And when he looked inside, he felt a wave of grief and horror that was so powerful he almost fainted right there. Because the trip that Mahmoud had been dreaming of for months, that he was returning home from now, was a journey to his home country of Iran to get married to the woman he loved, Katan. And now, inside the suitcase, was the dead body of his new wife, Katan, who Mahmoud had been trying to smuggle into America to start their new life together. Katan had run into issues with her visa in Frankfurt, and officials wouldn't let her board the plane to America. And so Katan and Mahmoud tried for days to fix this problem, but it became clear that only Mahmoud would be able to actually enter the United States, not Katan. And so ultimately, Katan willingly got into that suitcase. Mahmoud had not murdered her, or at least not intentionally so. She hadn't been trafficked or anything. She chose to get in that suitcase. Together, they decided that they would smuggle her in the cargo hold of the plane, and that's how they would get her to the United States. But during the flight, when she had boarded, she had been totally alive. But when she was in the cargo hold, other luggage had fallen and piled on top of her and slowly crushed her to death. And so when Mahmoud got to LAX and opened up the suitcase and saw what had happened, he panicked. He pulled the tags off the suitcase and left the suitcase and just got on his flight to Sacramento. And then once he landed there, he was so overcome with guilt and grief that 3 days later, he took his own life. When police searched Mahmoud's room, they found the little bound book full of photographs that he had so carefully packed for his trip to America. And those photos were of his and Katan's wedding. The following week, Mahmoud and Katan's bodies were sent back to Iran via the same route they had taken to get to Los Angeles. But this time, they traveled together. The next story is called Cold and Calculating. On the morning of December 11th, 1960, a 27-year-old man named Leonid Rogozov stood on the deck of a Soviet ship that was sailing across a freezing ocean at the very bottom of the world. Up ahead, finally, he could see the enormous, desolate white landmass of Antarctica, a continent that was too brutally cold for human civilization to last at scale. Basically, nobody lived there except for like a handful of scientists and other people who were researching the area, like Leonid. Antarctica was about to be Leonid's home for the next year and a half. And Leonid, he looked around him on the deck of the ship at the other 11 men who made up his team, and he smiled. They were all part of what was called the 6th Soviet Antarctic Expedition, and they'd been sailing for 36 days, all the way from Leningrad, Russia, to get here. Their job was to get to Antarctica, disembark, and then travel nearly 50 miles inland over brutal terrain, where they would eventually build a brand new scientific research facility from the ground up, and then they would stay there and begin studying the local climate. Leonid and the rest of the men had been chosen for this expedition because they all had specific skills that the team needed. Leonid was a meteorologist and also knew how to drive this special all-terrain vehicle that they'd brought on the ship. There were a few other meteorologists on the team, as well as several engineers and other scientists, and also one of the men was a doctor. Their work was part of a larger Cold War-era effort by the Soviet government to expand scientific research and knowledge. So Leonid saw this job both as a way of having this big adventure and also as a way of serving his country. And so he ultimately felt proud to be here. But as he was actually looking at the vast emptiness of Antarctica right in front of him for the first time, the reality of the situation they were in began to dawn on him, and he began to feel a jolt of fear. Everything on this expedition had to go exactly right, or he and the other men's lives would be in danger. This is not a safe place for people. They were arriving in a place with literally zero infrastructure, and they only had about 2 months before the polar winter was going to hit Antarctica, which meant they had to construct the entire research facility and make sure it was polar winter proof in those first 2 months, because that was their shelter. And just to make the stakes clear, if they didn't get it done in time, or if the structure was flawed in some way, they would almost certainly die. When the polar winter came, temperatures would drop as low as negative 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ocean would literally freeze solid. The closest help would be about 1,000 miles away and could take weeks or even months to arrive. And their only way to contact the outside world was with this long-range radio that was not always reliable. So essentially, Leonid and these 11 other men that made up this expedition, they were going to be completely isolated, with nobody to rely on except each other, until their scheduled pickup, which was in April of 1962. Again, a year and a half later. So now, when their ship docked on the coast of Antarctica, and the captain called out for everyone to start unloading the ship, Leonid hesitated, and so did some other men. This was it. This was the real start. But one at a time, they began grabbing their supplies and climbing down a ramp on the side of the ship. Leonid watched his fellow scientists step onto the snow, and as he did, he sort of shook off his own fear as a moment of weakness. Right now, he needed to be strong. And ultimately, Leonid was a very strong-willed person. He had been born in a remote village in eastern Siberia, so he knew he could handle the isolation and the extreme cold. He had already done that before. He was also the son of a World War II veteran who had died in combat. And his father had taught him to soldier on at all costs, even under the toughest circumstances. So right now, that's what Leonid did. He soldiered on. He took a deep breath of the ice-cold air, then grabbed his things, walked down the ramp, and stepped onto the snow with the others. And then once they had everything they had packed for the next 16 months off the ship, the crew on board the ship still wished all the men good luck, and then they lifted up the ramp. And then Leonid and the rest of the team watched as that ship began sailing away, leaving them all alone for the first time. At first, things at the new Antarctic Research Center went pretty well. Leonid and the team successfully built the entire research building in time before the polar winter, so when the worst weather came, they were able to hunker down inside and be safe. They'd also set up a whole bunch of atmospheric measurement tools that allowed them to study the Antarctic climate exactly as they wanted to. So by April, 4 months after getting dropped off by that ship, and now only about a month or so into the 6-month-long polar winter, the men, for the most part, were really just trying to stay warm, conserve their supplies, and gather data. However, they hit their first real snag on the morning of April 29th. Leonid woke up in his bunk that day with a stomachache. When Leonid woke up, he had that pain in his stomach, but he felt nauseous and so weak that he could barely roll over inside of his bed. And this really concerned Leonid, because getting a stomachache back at home was one thing, but getting a stomachache in Antarctica was totally different. For one, there was a huge blizzard going on outside that was making both land and air travel literally impossible, which meant that even if Leonid radioed for help, nobody would be able to get to him for a very long time. And to make matters even worse, at their research station, they didn't have access to most of the regular medical treatments that would have been available back at home. Basically, if this stomachache was anything serious, Leonid could die. As a result, Leonid would basically not allow himself to even consider the possibility that this stomachache was serious. Instead, he told himself that, he must have just eaten something weird. They were all living off of rations of preserved food, and so he figured he must have gotten a bad batch of something, and maybe he just had a mild case of food poisoning. So he dragged himself out of bed and he went to the kitchen for a glass of water to hopefully settle his stomach. But when he got there, he saw 2 other men, another meteorologist and an engineer, who were sitting at a nearby table having breakfast, and they took one look at Leonid and immediately asked him, hey, are you okay? And Leonid didn't want to worry them because, again, any medical emergency is a huge deal here for everybody. So he quickly forced a smile and said, oh yeah, everything's fine. Then Leonid quickly grabbed his glass of water, chugged it down, and made his way back to his bunk. And when he got there, he didn't just climb back in bed. Instead, he grabbed some clean clothes and a towel, and then walked down the hallway to the shower stalls. And he turned one on as hot as it would go, and then got inside. However, before he could even wash his hair, his vision began to go blurry around the edges, and his ears began to ring. He felt like he was about to faint, and he quickly sat down on the floor of the shower so he wouldn't fall and hurt himself. And as he was sitting there with his head spinning and the hot water raining down on him, the dull, aching pain in his stomach suddenly sharpened. It was like a horrible, stabbing pain ripping through his stomach now. Leonid barely had time to wrap a towel around his waist and rush to a toilet before he began to vomit. A few minutes later, Leonid stumbled into a small storage closet where the research team kept a reserve of basic medications like pain relievers and antibiotics. Leonid took some antibiotics and tried to power through the day, but that pain in his abdomen just got more and more intense. Eventually, he told the other men on his team that he really had to stop, lie down, and rest, that something was wrong here, but maybe if he just lays down long enough, it'll go away. Leonid would spend the entire evening going back and forth from his bed to the toilet because he kept vomiting, and he didn't sleep at all that night. And by the next morning, April 30th, Leonid was in so much pain that he really couldn't even try to hide it anymore. He was still vomiting, he was still very dizzy to the point where he could barely stand up, and he could tell he was also running a very high fever. However, what really scared Leonid the most was what his belly actually looked like. He had not been able to keep any food down for the last 24 hours, so he knew his stomach was completely empty, and yet he was so bloated that his belly was sticking out like a balloon. And so lying in bed, feeling feverish, nauseous, and dizzy, and looking down at his grotesquely swollen abdomen, Leonid had to admit to himself that this was definitely more than just food poisoning. Something was very wrong, and he needed help. The scientific research team's doctor took stock of all of Leonid's symptoms, and he immediately came up with a diagnosis. And the diagnosis was simple, but the treatment was not. Leonid definitely did not have food poisoning. He was in a life or death situation. This was a very serious thing. But to save him, the doctor was going to have to perform a surgery that had only ever been done successfully 2 times in all of history. And that was because this surgery required a very risky technique that most doctors refused to even try because it was so dangerous, both to the patient and also to the doctor. Basically, Leonid was likely going to die if the doctor attempted the surgery, but Leonid was definitely going to die if he didn't. And so ultimately, a decision was made that the doctor would give it his best try. At least that way, they were trying to save Leonid's life, even if they were unsuccessful. At 2 a.m. that night, so technically early morning on May 1st, the doctor took a deep breath and mentally prepared themselves for this surgery. Leonid was lying on a makeshift operating table inside the research center. He was wearing a surgical gown, and despite the fact he was about to undergo real surgery here, he was wide awake because he had to be. Due to the nature of this incredibly risky and rare surgery, the doctor couldn't actually give Leonid any real anesthesia to knock him out. Leonid had to be wide awake and fully aware for this entire procedure, which meant all he could get were some local anesthetics, which sort of dulled the pain but did not get rid of it. The doctor looked over at the 4 other research team members who were in the operating room. There was a driver, a meteorologist, and 2 aerologists, which are scientists who study the Earth's atmosphere. Now, none of these 4 had any real medical training, but the doctor needed assistance to do this operation, so he'd recruited them to help him out. Leonid had his head propped up with pillows, and his knees were turned to the left, so he was twisted into a position where the lower right side of his abdomen was facing up towards the ceiling. The doctor had already cut a hole in his hospital gown, so Leonid's swollen stomach was visible. And now, through that hole, the doctor injected Novocaine, which is a type of local anesthetic, right into Leonid's abdomen. And then once the Novocaine took effect, the doctor used a scalpel to carefully make a 4-inch long incision into Leonid's lower abdomen. Leonid took in a sharp breath, but he did his best to stay perfectly still. The incision began to bleed heavily, and one of the assistants came over and used a pair of metal tongs to spread open Leonid's skin and muscles and fat, revealing Leonid's internal organs. At this point, the doctor was so nervous that his hands began to shake, but he took a deep breath and slowly cut his way with the scalpel through the protective membrane that surrounded Leonid's organs. But as he did, he accidentally poked a hole in Leonid's large intestine, and Leonid noticed right away because he began gushing blood. And when the doctor realized what he'd done, he sort of began to panic, and he began yelling for the assistants to hand him his surgical sewing kit. And when they did, he kind of clumsily began trying to sew the hole shut. But by the time the doctor had finally closed up the wound, Leonid had already lost a lot of blood. And the real problem, the reason the doctor was doing this surgery in the first place, still had not been solved. Like, the surgery had not really even happened. We just had this incision, that's it. And so the doctor knew he really had to hurry before Leonid bled out. And so he threw his standard operating procedures out the window. He just had to go for it here. So he just took one of his hands and reached inside of Leonid's abdominal cavity and started literally feeling around, trying to find the source of Leonid's illness. But as he did, it was like all the blood drained out of Leonid's face. I mean, he's feeling this. This must have been horrific. His body went limp and his head kind of rolled back on his pillow. And this was actually the exact moment that this surgery truly became its most dangerous. Not just for Leonid, but for the doctor too. Right as Leonid's head rolled backwards, the doctor felt himself go weak, and suddenly he was seeing stars. And this was because Leonid and the doctor were actually the same person. In addition to being a meteorologist and a driver of that special vehicle, Leonid was also a recent medical school graduate, and he was the one doctor at this research station. So Leonid was performing surgery on himself. He had given himself that Novocaine shot, and then forced himself to stay still as he carved a 4-inch long incision into his own abdomen, accidentally slicing into his intestines that he had the wherewithal to then stitch up as he's bleeding to death, and then he shoved his own hand into his abdominal cavity. But it was at that point that Leonid actually looked like he might die, because he began to show signs like he was going to pass out, likely from blood loss or just shock. But he'd given his assistants specific instruction on what to do if he passed out during the procedure. They were supposed to inject him with a specific drug mixture and then give him CPR until he woke up. But just as one of the assistants readied the needle to inject into Leonid, because it did appear like he was about to pass out, Leonid suddenly sucked in a huge breath and his head snapped back up. Leonid, with his hand still inside of his abdomen, told his assistants that he was okay. Then he looked over at the mirror that one of his assistants had been holding up this whole time so that he could see what he was doing during the surgery. And with a combination of the mirror and just sort of feeling around inside of his own body, which must have been horrifically painful, Leonid finally found the thing that was making him so sick. It was his appendix. This entire time, Leonid had been suffering from acute appendicitis. Then he cleaned out his abdominal cavity with antibiotics and then sutured up the entire incision. When he was finally all done, Leonid examined his appendix that he had cut out of himself, and he saw there was this dark, diseased-looking spot right on the bottom of it. Leonid estimated that if he had not removed this thing, it very likely would have burst in less than 24 hours, and that definitely would have killed him. Within just 2 weeks, Leonid was back up on his feet and helping out at the research center like normal. And when the whole team went back home to the Soviet Union in April of 1962, so about a year after Leonid's self-surgery, he was greeted like a hero. The government actually gave him a medal called the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, which was for extraordinary contributions to Soviet society. And he would go down in history as the third person to ever perform a successful auto-appendectomy, and he did it outside of a real hospital with no other trained medical professionals anywhere nearby. And that's actually not the only way that Leonid's legacy lived on. Today, some countries actually require doctors who are stationed in Antarctica to undergo preventative appendectomies, just so that they will never be in a situation like Leonid. Because it turns out, the one thing you really can't bring to Antarctica is your appendix. It had been a muggy day in North Texas on July 6, 2019, but the oppressive heat began to let up right as the sun set, and by 7 p.m., it had become an ideal summer night of about 73 degrees Fahrenheit. And so it seemed like the perfect Saturday night to go out in town. But 49-year-old Manuela Allen, known to her friends and family as just Manu, along with her husband Peter, had the house all to themselves that evening. So instead of going out to enjoy the pleasant summer weather, they decided instead to have a relaxing night in, just the two of them, on the couch just watching TV together. Peter and Manu had not had many evenings alone like this in their 23 years of marriage. And that was because they had spent most of those years raising their 4 kids. So this was a house that had constantly buzzed with activity and noise. But now, all but one of their 4 kids had graduated from high school, and their oldest son was away at college. So the house was getting quieter. And Manu and Peter were already thinking about how someday soon it might just be the 2 of them living here. And as much as they loved their children, it was nights like this that made them kind of look forward to the day that they would be empty nesters. Peter grabbed his glass that contained some vodka from the end table and took a sip, and then he and Manu leaned back on the couch to watch a replay of a Texas Rangers baseball game. Manu loved sports, and while baseball was not her favorite, it would have to do until football season rolled back around. Manu and Peter lived in the small Texas town of Olney with a population of just 3,000 people, and the nearest city with a major football team was over 2 hours away. But both Manu and Peter were teachers at Olney High School, and so during football season, they went to watch their beloved Olney Cubs play every Friday night. Manu didn't care that the Cubs were on the 3rd longest losing streak in the state of Texas. She just loved going to support her students who were on the team, and she enjoyed the camaraderie of sitting in the stands along with her friends and her family. As a teacher, Manu felt responsible for her students, even when they were outside the classroom. So she dedicated a lot of her time to tutoring and mentoring students, especially the ones that seemed to have the most issues, even beyond just schoolwork issues. Kids that had problems at home or kids who had behavioral issues. Manu was all about helping those kids. But the upcoming school year and the roaring crowds in the stands on Friday nights felt really far away for Manu on this relaxing summer evening, and the sound of the baseball game on TV started to become white noise for her, and by 10 p.m., she could barely keep her eyes open. Peter noticed his wife nodding off, and he gently nudged her and asked if she wanted to go to bed. Manu looked over at the clock and said she should get some sleep. Peter gave his wife a kiss, and Manu stood up, and she shuffled down the hallway, entered the master bedroom, and closed the door behind her. Peter would not be joining his wife tonight in the master bedroom. He and Manu had this understanding that on any night when Peter drank, even if it was just one drink, he would have to sleep on the couch. So, with his glass of vodka still half full, this would be one of those nights. Peter continued watching TV and slowly nursing his drink, and he started to feel tired. And then around 11:30, the couple's 20-year-old son, Darian, came home. He let himself in with a key, nodded to his dad, and went upstairs to his own bedroom. But then, around 15 minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. Peter stood up and groaned a bit as he walked bleary-eyed towards the front door. He unlocked it and opened it up. And outside the door stood the couple's 15-year-old daughter, Kiara. She said hi to her dad, walked right past him, and went straight to her room. Peter sat back down on the couch. The couple's 18-year-old daughter, Melanie, was away on a weekend trip with her friends, so she wasn't expected home. And at this point, it was close to midnight, so Peter dimmed the lights, reclined on the couch, and slowly drifted off to sleep while the TV stayed on at a low volume. A little after 8 a.m. the next morning, Peter woke up feeling like he could have used maybe another hour or 2 of sleep. Now, it was Saturday, and if Peter wanted to, he could keep sleeping, but even on these weekends, Peter just could not seem to sleep in. He just automatically got up. So Peter climbed up from the couch, grabbed his computer, and then went back to the couch to read some news online. At the same time Peter was doing this, his daughter Kiara had just woken up as well, and she was getting ready to go to the gym, but first, she wanted to put her dirty clothes in the washing machine. The Allen house had 5 bedrooms, but it was still a fairly compact house, just a little over 2,000 square feet. And the house was laid out in a way where Kiara actually had to go through her parents' master bedroom, which was right next to her own bedroom, in order to get into the laundry room. So Kiara stepped out of her room and then tried turning the knob to the master bedroom, but she found the door was locked from the inside. Kiara walked down the hall and saw her dad on the computer, and she asked him where Mom was. And Peter just said, "Oh, check the master bedroom." Kiara said she already had, and the door was locked. Peter then told his daughter to just go around through the garage, because in their house, the master bedroom had 2 entrances. There was one in the hallway inside of the house, which is the door that was locked, and then the other entrance was through the laundry room on the other side, which connected to the garage. So Kiara stepped outside of the house and went into the garage, and she walked into the laundry room, and then she reached the door that led into the master bedroom, and when she tried the doorknob, it was unlocked. So she swung it open, she stepped inside, and she froze, because what she saw was horrifying. Kiara turned and ran back outside, back around into the main house, ran to her dad and said, "Mom is not in the bedroom," and there was blood everywhere. Peter instantly sprung up, raced outside into the garage and into the master bedroom, and right away he stepped in this big puddle of blood in the carpet, and he looked around the master and there really was blood everywhere, and his wife was nowhere to be seen. Peter instantly thought his wife must be badly injured somewhere, so he ran from the master bedroom, with Kiara now following behind him, back into the garage and then out to the driveway, and that's when he realized Manu's car was gone. Peter turned to his daughter and said, Mom must have hurt herself and driven herself to the hospital. And so Peter called his wife's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. So a few minutes later, Peter and Kiara got into his car and they sped to a nearby hospital, thinking that's where Manu's going to be. But when they got there, Peter slowly drove through the parking lot of the emergency room looking for Manu's white SUV, but they didn't see it anywhere. So they parked the car and they went inside the hospital and asked the staff if Manuela Allen had been admitted, and they said no. So Peter and Kiara left that hospital, went to another nearby hospital, but again, Manu's car was not there and the staff said she had not admitted herself. And so Peter and Kiara returned home, and at this point, Peter dialed 911. And he explained to the operator that his wife was missing and there was blood all over her bedroom. The first officer who arrived at the Allen house met with Peter outside. He asked Peter what was going on, and Peter told the officer that he really had no idea. His daughter Kiara had come to him that morning saying their mom was gone and there was blood all over the bedroom, and then he went and checked and he saw the same thing, and then he went out to the driveway and he noticed his wife's car was gone. Peter explained that he and Kiara then drove to 2 hospitals thinking his wife must have gotten hurt and then driven herself to a hospital, but when they got to the 2 hospitals, his wife wasn't there and they said they had not seen her. The officer noticed that as Peter was explaining the story, he seemed totally calm and not shaken or panicked or really showing any kind of emotion, and that just seemed unusual to the officer, considering the circumstances Peter had just described. I mean, his wife, at a minimum, seems to have been gravely hurt if she's not already deceased, and so you would think that would elicit a bigger reaction. But the officer kept that to himself, and instead he had Peter lead him inside the residence to the master bedroom. And the first thing the officer noticed was that the bed had been stripped bare, and there was a bloody pillow on the floor next to the bed. And he did see blood spatter all over the room, across the mattress, the closet doors, and the wall. In fact, there was so much blood that the officer did not believe a person could survive having lost that much of it. And so he wondered to himself why Peter didn't immediately call 911 instead of getting in the car with his daughter and driving around to various hospitals first. It seemed obvious this was an emergency, so why wasn't it treated that way? Then the officer noticed something else on the bedroom floor. It was a knife. And so at this point, it was obvious this was a crime scene, so he asked Peter and Kiara to clear out of the master bedroom and go wait for him on their couch. And so after the father and daughter had stepped out of the room, the officer walked outside and went to the garage. And immediately, he saw bloody streaks on the ground, and he traced them through the laundry room and back to the door of the master bedroom. And he recognized these bloody streaks had to be drag marks. Everything the officer saw painted a picture of a very violent struggle having taken place in the bedroom, most likely sometime during the night. The officer then walked back into the house and observed bloody footprints leading from the master bedroom to the kitchen, right to a spot next to the refrigerator. And so the officer walked into the living room where Peter and Kiara were, and he asked Peter about these footprints and, why would somebody go into the kitchen potentially? And Peter explained that actually his wife kept her keys on a hook right next to the refrigerator, and her keys were gone along with her car. And so at this point, the officer radioed dispatch for help and said the police should now be on the lookout for Manu's vehicle, because clearly either Manu or someone who harmed Manu had taken the keys and taken the vehicle. A few minutes later, Sergeant Dan Burbeck of the Young County Sheriff's Department, along with a couple of local police from Olney, pulled up in front of the Allen house. And the officer who had first arrived on scene walked up to Burbeck and briefed him on what he had seen. After being briefed up, Sergeant Burbeck immediately walked into the Allen house and told Peter and Kiara that they would need to step outside. As Peter and his daughter walked out onto the porch, Peter told Burbeck that actually one of his other kids was still in the house upstairs. So Burbeck told the father and the daughter to stay outside, and then Burbeck walked into the house and upstairs to a second-floor bedroom, opened the door, and found 20-year-old Darian inside with his headphones on playing video games. Burbeck asked Darian to come outside with him, and Darian, who looked very confused, asked what was going on here. But Burbeck just said he needed Darian to leave the house right now. So Darian just did as he was told and stood up and followed the detective downstairs, and then he, along with Burbeck, joined Peter and Kiara outside on the porch. Once they were out there, Burbeck began questioning them, starting with the husband, Peter. Burbeck asked Peter, why did you sleep on the couch that night instead of in your bed with your wife? Peter explained the agreement he had with Manu, that whenever he drank, no matter how much, he would sleep on the couch. Now, Sergeant Burbeck kept this to himself, but right away he wondered, why would you have that agreement in place? Was Peter like a maniac when he drank? Did he get violent? What was going on here? Burbeck then proceeded to ask each member of the family if they had heard anything unusual during the night before, because Burbeck assumed someone in the house must have heard something considering the crime scene in the master bedroom. And the couch where Peter slept was only about 20 steps away from the master bedroom. Kiara was in the bedroom right next door to the master bedroom, and Darian was right above it in the upstairs bedroom. It just seemed impossible that such a violent struggle could have taken place with them not hearing anything. But Peter said he really heard nothing, aside from the sound of an engine, which he thought could have been his wife's SUV, starting up around dawn. And he said the sound actually woke him up, but he went right back to sleep and figured it was not a big deal, whatever it was. Burbeck asked Peter, is it normal for your wife to just get up and leave in the middle of the morning like that? Didn't you think to maybe ask her where she was going? Peter replied that it was not his job to keep tabs on his wife. Darian, who had been upstairs, said the whole night he'd had his headphones on and was playing video games. The only thing he said he heard over the course of the whole night was a rustling sound coming from the kitchen, sometime between maybe 3 and 5 a.m., but he figured it was just his dad maybe getting a snack. And then Kiara, who was in the room right next door to where her mother appeared to have been in some life and death struggle, said she really had heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. Now, Burbeck, by this point, looked totally stunned by their answers, and so Kiara, who kind of picked up on his suspicion, she quickly explained that she had been out that night, and when she got home, she went straight to her room, slipped into her bed, put her earbuds in, which would have nullified the noise, and she FaceTimed with her boyfriend. And then after the call, she fell asleep still with the earbuds in her ears, which again could have prevented her from hearing anything. Burbeck didn't know what to believe here, but he just still felt like something was off. Maybe these family members know more than they're letting on. But he obviously had no proof, and so Burbeck told the family that, when he was done here at the house, he wanted them to come to the station so he could speak to them further. It was around this time that Lieutenant David Wilk was driving past the Allen family house when he saw the yellow crime scene tape stretched out around their property. Now, Lieutenant Wilk worked for the sheriff's department that was the next county over, so he had no idea what this crime scene tape was about, but he did know the Allens personally. In fact, his son was a football player at Olney High School, and the boy adored Manu. So Lieutenant Wilk just really liked the Allen family, and seeing the crime scene tape, it just made his stomach drop, because he knew, obviously, something bad had happened. Wilk immediately pulled over, got out of his car, and introduced himself to a local police officer he saw standing outside of the residence. And Wilk asked the officer, what's going on here? And the officer told Wilk that Mrs. Allen was missing, and it didn't look good. Wilk asked if there was anything he could do to help, and the officer told him that actually right now, other patrol units were out looking for Manu's white SUV, and so if Wilk wanted to, he could join in that search. And Wilk said yes, where should I look? And the officer suggested that maybe he explore the recreational area around Lake Cooper, which was a very popular swimming hole about 8 miles north of town. And so the officer gave Lieutenant Wilk a description of Manu's vehicle and her license plate number, and then Wilk left, got back in his car, and began driving north until he reached the lake area. There, he pulled into the recreational area and began driving along the perimeter of the lake. And as he approached a boat ramp, something on the other side of the lake near the dam drew his attention. It was a white SUV, just like Manu's missing vehicle. And so Lieutenant Wilk parked, got out of his car, and walked around the lake to where this white SUV was parked. And as Wilk got closer to it, he could see there was nobody in or around the SUV. He could also see that the SUV appeared to be stuck on a large mound of dirt, with all 4 wheels kind of hovering off the ground, as if somebody had driven it there, gotten it stuck, and then left. Wilk approached the driver's side of the vehicle, and he noticed there were brown smears near the door handle. He leaned in closer, and he saw that these smears were clearly bloody fingerprints. So immediately, Wilk turned on his body camera and proceeded to film and photograph the car, both outside and in, and also the area around it. And then when he was done, he decided to just go ahead and search the whole area, because obviously, this could be connected to Manu, and maybe she was out here somewhere. And so Wilk walked towards a fence that was a short distance away from the car, and then once he got there, he turned around and just began scanning the entire area. And that's when something else caught his eye. It was something off in the distance, beneath a thicket of trees. It looked sort of like a pile of laundry on the ground. Wilk began walking towards it, and as he did, he realized this was not just some pile of laundry. It looked like it was the outline of a white bed sheet, and very clearly this sheet was wrapped around something fairly big. And so Wilk picked up his pace a bit, and as he got closer, he began to see there were bloodstains on the outside of these sheets, and then when he was right on top, it was obvious that there was a dead body wrapped up inside of the sheets. Wilk had a sick feeling because he was sure the person who was inside of these sheets would be identified as Manu. And so he called into the Young County Sheriff's Department and said he'd found a dead body, and it was almost certainly the one they were looking for. Back at the Allen house, Sergeant Burbeck heard about the discovery of a body on his radio, and so now that this was officially a homicide case, he reached out to the state police, known as the Texas Rangers, for help. He arranged for Peter, Kiara, and Darian to be taken to the nearest Texas Ranger station, and then he got into his cruiser and drove down to the lake, as other county and state police headed that way as well. Burbeck arrived at the lake, and Lieutenant Wilk led him to the body that was still wrapped in the sheets. Since Wilk was not working the case in any official capacity, he'd left the body as he'd found it. So Sergeant Burbeck leaned down and began pulling away the sheets and also some yucca leaves that had covered up the victim's face, and then once the victim was exposed, Lieutenant Wilk, who was standing nearby and who knew Manu personally, was able to positively identify her. Manu was deceased. Burbeck and a few of the other officers who had arrived put up crime scene tape while they waited for a forensics team to get there. Burbeck turned to one of the officers and shared his opinion that the killer was almost certainly someone Manu knew. He pointed out that the violence inside of her home was so brutal that it just seemed personal, and also the fact that her face seemed to be covered up with leaves when they found her, well, that was something he'd seen before when the killer was someone close to the victim. Then Burbeck radioed the Texas Rangers down at the station where he'd sent Manu's family, and one of the Rangers broke the news to Peter that unfortunately his wife's body had been found. Now, by this point, Peter and Manu's oldest daughter, Melanie, had returned from her overnight trip, and their oldest son had also come back from his college campus, and so they were also with Peter and Kiara and Darian at the station. And so the Rangers watched Peter closely as he turned and told the 4 children the news about their mother. The 2 oldest immediately broke down and cried, and Kiara, who had first discovered the blood in the bedroom, collapsed to the floor. But Darian, who said he'd been up all night playing video games, didn't break down. He just walked away and sat in a corner by himself. The Rangers noticed this and actually went to another room to talk about how odd it was that Darian had not started crying and had just sort of sat down. So they decided Darian should be the first person they speak to. And so a few minutes later, one of the Rangers sat down with Darian in an interview room and asked him how he had been getting along with his mother in recent weeks. And Darian admitted that he and his mother had actually been arguing a lot about his college plans. Darian was 20 years old, but he spent basically all of his time in his room playing video games. Now, Darian was perfectly fine with that. He figured he would get his life together at some point, but Manu wanted him to act now, to go enroll in college. But Darian said he didn't want to go back to school and just sort of wished his mom would leave him alone. After this, the Ranger just asked Darian point blank if he had anything to do with his mother's death. And Darian was immediately adamant that no, he would never hurt his mom. So the Ranger asked him if he would consent to being fingerprinted, and Darian said yes, of course. Peter was the next to be interviewed, and he was unemotional just like he had been with police at the house. The Ranger thought this was strange, so he pointed out that Peter seemed to be handling the situation quite calmly. Peter explained that his background was he had been in the Army as a part of their Special Forces unit, the Green Berets, and so he had been trained to keep cool under pressure, and that was just what he was defaulting to. But Peter clearly understood what the Ranger was hinting at here, that he was suspicious of Peter, so Peter quickly added that of course he wanted justice for his wife here. And then after that, Peter said very calmly that he also owned a whole lot of firearms and a whole bunch of ammunition, and he'd make sure his wife's killer saw justice one way or the other. The Ranger just stared at Peter for a second, not convinced if Peter really was being genuine about potentially going out and seeking vigilante justice, or if maybe this was just performative, that this was Peter's way of kind of acting out his emotions. And so the Ranger decided to just kind of move on. And he asked Peter, you heard that car start sometime in the morning and you believed it was your wife's car. How did you hear that noise? How did that wake you up? But the violent attack on your wife in your bedroom just down the hall didn't wake you up. Peter said he couldn't really offer an explanation, but he did offer a theory, which was that maybe Manu's killer put their hand over his wife's mouth. Sometimes violent struggles are silent, he said. The Ranger couldn't help but just shake his head. At this point, the Ranger was starting to feel like Peter had already thought of an answer for everything, like he had prepped for this interview. The pair spoke for a bit longer, kind of rehashing details, and then at some point the ranger thanked Peter for coming in and told Peter that somebody would follow up with him soon. After that, the rangers would speak to the two oldest Allen children separately, and then finally, after the longest day of their lives, the Allen family were told they could go. However, they were told they were not allowed to return to their home because their house was now a crime scene. So Peter made a few phone calls, and a friend agreed to let them stay at his Airbnb until they could go home. The next day, Sergeant Burbeck got a call from the medical examiner who had Manu's autopsy results. The medical examiner revealed that Manu had been stabbed multiple times, and she had defensive wounds on her hands. She had also been strangled, and her neck was broken. And what's more, after Manu had been taken to the lake, the killer had shot her in the face after she was dead. The violence had been even more extreme than Burbeck realized, and this only convinced him further that Manu's killer had to be somebody close to her that had some sort of personal issue with her. Then Burbeck and members of the state police met with forensics investigators who had processed the scene out by the lake, and they had found shoe prints in the mud near Manu's stranded SUV and bicycle tracks that led away from the SUV out of the recreational area and onto the main road. And so while investigators followed up on these shoe prints and bike tracks, word of Manu's murder quickly spread through the small Texas town. Students at Olney High School, where Manu worked, were devastated when they learned of the death of their beloved teacher. And also rumors began to fly, in particular on a Facebook group called Rants and Raves, where citizens of Olney voiced their theories about what they thought happened in the Allen house on the night of the murder. And most of those amateur theories pointed the finger at Peter. And Peter suddenly began noticing that people around town were treating him differently. They were treating him with suspicion. A few days after Manu's death, Peter and his kids were finally allowed to return to their family home. And when they got there, Darian helped his father secure the house by bolting the windows shut, and Peter said he would sleep with a gun under his pillow because he said the killer was still out there. The next morning, Peter was contacted by Burbeck and asked to come in for another interview. And so Peter drove to the station where Burbeck and a Texas Ranger met him and led him into an interview room. The Ranger began the interview by asking Peter why someone might want to kill his wife. In response to this question, Peter referred to his large collection of guns. He said he had a ton of them, at least maybe 100, and a lot of people knew about them. So he said, maybe somebody broke into the house to try to steal the guns. And actually, Peter said he had a pistol, a communist block pistol, that he kept in a drawer, and when he had finally gotten back to his home the day before, he noticed that that pistol was missing. Burbeck noted everything Peter was saying in his memo pad, and he began to feel even more confident that Peter did have something to do with his wife's murder. Burbeck felt like Peter was trying to influence the investigation by suggesting an angle that would divert attention away from him. So Burbeck and the Ranger stepped out of the room and talked for a second and decided to shift to a more confrontational tone with Peter. So they went back into the interview room and they revealed to Peter that in the master bedroom where his wife was horribly attacked and killed, they had found a bloody sock which matched footprints left by the killer. And it happened to be the exact same type of compression sock that Peter wore because they found socks just like those in his drawer. And so they asked Peter to please explain that. And Peter said he really couldn't. He just kept repeating that he did not hurt his wife. And so at some point, the Ranger asked how someone other than the family would know exactly where Manu kept her car keys, because that's where the footprints went, right next to the fridge, and the keys were gone, and the car was gone. And Peter just lowered his head and stared down at the floor and said again, he just had no explanation. And so Burbeck and the Ranger continued drilling Peter, trying to get more information from him, but Peter really didn't have any more information. He really stuck to this idea that he did not do anything wrong. And so eventually, at the end of the interview, it was clear there was not enough evidence to arrest Peter, and so Peter was told to go home, and that if they needed him again, they'd be in touch. Sergeant Burbeck was sitting in his office that afternoon when he got a report from one of the Rangers who had been out in the field canvassing for witnesses. Burbeck learned that the officer had made contact with an oilfield worker who was on duty in the area near Lake Cooper on the same morning Manu's body had been found. The worker had been out near the recreation area when he noticed someone on a bicycle pedaling away from the lake and in the direction of Olney. The worker stated that this actually struck him as pretty odd because it was so early in the morning, just after dawn, and even though people did bike in that area, he never saw people biking that early in that area. However, the worker said he didn't really get a good look at the person riding the bike. He could only remember that the bicyclist wore shorts and had a backpack on. And so Sergeant Burbeck assigned 2 investigators to contact area businesses along the route from Lake Cooper to Olney to see if any of them had surveillance cameras that were running that morning that maybe picked up some footage of this person on the bike. And sure enough, the investigators found a local bank whose surveillance footage outside had captured an individual on a bicycle wearing shorts and a backpack, just like the oilfield worker had described. Burbeck took a look at this footage and he was unable to make out the facial features of the individual on the bike. However, he was able to glean enough information from the footage about the person's general age, sex, and build to potentially narrow the suspect pool down. Burbeck was also still convinced Peter had something to do with his wife's murder, but he knew he didn't have enough evidence to move forward with an arrest. But what he could do was try to rule out other possibilities, like for example Peter's theory about a burglar trying to steal his guns, because if he could rule that out, it would only help strengthen the case against Peter. So Burbeck began looking into recent gun burglaries in the area, and there was only one. And the homeowner who was targeted happened to be the father of a friend of Darian Allen's. Burbeck wondered if that was more than just a coincidence. After all, everyone in the town of Olney was connected by no more than 2 degrees of separation, so maybe it didn't mean anything. But Burbeck knew he would have to dig into it further. So he began reading the reports that were made from this burglary investigation, and in examining the leads that had been developed, one name stood out. And that name was Corey Taylor. Corey was a young guy who was a loner, who was known around town as a troublemaker, and he'd had numerous run-ins with law enforcement. And he also had what looked like a love affair with guns. Burbeck found a video on Corey's Snapchat of him showing off a semi-automatic rifle with a sight attached to it. So Burbeck decided to pay Corey a visit. He drove to Corey's apartment complex and began walking towards Corey's place. And as Burbeck made his way towards the stairwell, he saw something that made him slow down and then back up. Because in the storage space underneath the stairs right in front of him was a bicycle. Burbeck knelt down to inspect the tread pattern on the bicycle's tires, and he wasn't 100% sure, but the treads looked a whole lot like the bicycle tracks that were found down by the lake. Burbeck took a picture of the treads, and then proceeded up the stairs to Corey's apartment. When he got to the door, Burbeck knocked, and Corey opened it up. Burbeck introduced himself, and Corey allowed Burbeck inside. And right away Burbeck noticed that Corey appeared to be very nervous, like he couldn't even stand still. Burbeck asked Corey if he knew about what happened to Manu Allen, and Corey said he was aware of what happened to Mrs. Allen. He said he knew her as Mrs. Allen because he knew her from his high school, Olney High School, where she worked. And he said everybody knew what happened to her. It was horrible. But Corey said he didn't know her well, and he'd never been inside of her house. Burbeck then asked Corey if he owned the bike that was outside under the stairwell. And Corey said no, the bike was not his, it belonged to his friend, Julius Mullins. Burbeck recorded this name in his notepad, and he and Corey talked for a few minutes longer, and then he left. And within a day, investigators had tracked down this new person Corey had mentioned, Julius Mullins, and they brought him in for an interview. Investigators asked Julius where he was on the night of July 6th, and Julius said that he had gone to a party. Afterward, he had gone to Corey's apartment, let himself in, and crashed there. He said he didn't actually see Corey that night, so he wasn't sure if Corey was actually in the apartment or not. And so this sounded pretty odd that he just crashed at Corey's place and didn't even know if his friend was there, but it sounded like the two were close friends and maybe this was normal. And so eventually the investigators just asked Julius if he would submit fingerprints and DNA, and Julius voluntarily submitted both and was then allowed to leave. A day later, one of the rangers who had been working the case returned to Corey's apartment to confiscate the bicycle that Burbeck had seen underneath the stairwell, and as the ranger was approaching the stairs, he suddenly had a chance encounter with someone he was very familiar with. On a whim, the ranger asked this person if he could look at the bottom of their shoes, and the person said, yeah, sure. So the ranger looked at the bottom of their shoes, and when he did, the ranger could barely contain his excitement, because he knew he had just broken the case wide open. Investigators would meet with this person the ranger had just happened to run into, and after that interview, they knew who had killed Manu Allen. Here is a reconstruction of what police think happened to Manu Allen in the early morning of July 7th, 2019. Around 2 a.m., Manu's killer quietly climbed through a window in the garage of the Allen's household and then made their way into the hallway of the house. From there, they quietly crept down the hallway and went into the master bedroom where Manu was sleeping in the bed. Now, the killer tried to be quiet, but Manu was a light sleeper, and very quickly, they woke Manu up. And when the killer noticed that Manu was sitting awake in the bed, looking over at them, the killer froze for a second, but then suddenly the killer reached out and grabbed a butterfly knife off the dresser and just jumped on top of Manu before she could do anything, and the killer began furiously stabbing her. Manu tried to shield herself from the knife, but the killer plunged it into her again and again in this frenzied attack, eventually rolling Manu over, jamming her head into the mattress, and then jabbing the knife into her head multiple times. And after the 47th and final stab wound, the killer dropped the knife onto the bed. But the killer convinced themselves that Manu was not dead. She was still breathing. So the killer wrapped their hands around Manu's neck and squeezed as hard as they could until they were sure she was dead. The killer then wiped the knife off on the sheets and then placed the knife into their backpack. Then they took the bed sheets and kind of wrapped them all around Manu, who was on the bed, and then they dragged Manu inside of these sheets off the bed onto the ground. Then the killer casually walked out of the bedroom into the kitchen to retrieve the car keys from the spot where Manu always kept them. And so with Manu's keys in hand, the killer returned to the master bedroom, locking the door behind them, and then they dragged Manu in the bed sheets out the other door of the master bedroom, through the laundry room and the garage, and then outside to Manu's SUV. There, the killer put Manu's body, still wrapped in the sheets, in the trunk, and then they also placed the bike that they had driven over to the Allen's house into Manu's SUV. Once Manu's SUV was all packed up, the killer hopped in the driver's seat and drove 8 miles north to the recreational area by the lake, but as they were driving along, the SUV got stuck. So at that point, the killer hopped out of the SUV and removed Manu from the vehicle and dragged her over to the spot where she would later be found. However, before the killer actually left Manu there, they pulled out a gun and shot Manu in the face, even though at this point Manu was obviously already dead. Then, after covering up Manu's face with some leaves, the killer walked back over to the SUV, took the bike out, and then pedaled away from the scene back towards town. Police would track down Manu's killer and place them under arrest. And then once they were brought into an interrogation room, investigators asked them why. Why had they killed Manu? And that's when the killer claimed that Manu's husband, Peter, had made them do it. The killer said Peter had cornered them at a convenience store and made them get into his car and put a gun to the killer's head and said, "You're going to kill my wife." But as much as investigators had suspected Peter at different times during this investigation, this story didn't make sense with the timeline of the murder. And the forensics, both the fingerprints and DNA, implicated only one person, Julius Mullins. Julius was the owner of the bike who had stored it under the stairs at his friend's apartment, but more importantly, Julius was the ex-boyfriend of Peter and Manu's oldest daughter, Melanie. The pair had dated for a year when Melanie was a junior in high school. Julius's home life was undeniably rough, and there were times when his parents would kick him out of the house and he would have no place to sleep. Sometimes the only high school coaches would let Julius, who played tight end for the football team, sleep in the gym. And on at least one occasion, when Julius had been kicked out, Manu had allowed Julius to sleep over at their house. And also, Julius was a frequent visitor to the Allen's household, but just for the day, he'd come over for a couple hours at a time to see Melanie. And so it was during these frequent visits that Julius learned where Manu kept her car keys, which is how he knew where to go in the kitchen to find them. Manu always treated Julius incredibly kindly because she was just a person who really looked out for the kids in this town. I mean, she was always spending her spare time looking after kids and mentoring kids and tutoring kids, especially kids who had rough home lives like Julius did. And so Julius was no exception to her kindness. Manu would sometimes help him with his homework and, talk to him and make sure he was doing okay. But during Manu's daughter's relationship with Julius, it seemed like Julius's behavior began to change. He was very temperamental and moody and just seemed like he was snowballing. And so eventually, Melanie broke off the relationship, and Manu kind of stopped talking to him as well, and Julius did not take it well. And this was about 7 months prior to the murder. Police noticed that when they brought Julius in for his first interview, that he had cuts and scrapes all over his arms and legs. And when that ranger went to retrieve the bike from Corey's apartment, Julius was the person he ran into who he was very familiar with because of this case. And he asked Julius to see the soles of his shoes, and when Julius showed him, it was immediately apparent that they matched the shoe prints that had been found by the lake where Manu's body was discovered. The shoes were later found to be an exact match, and the treads on Julius's bicycle were also an exact match to the tracks that were found leaving the scene. Investigators also performed a sound test at the Allen residence, with one ranger in the master bedroom and the other on the couch where Peter had been asleep, and they turned the TV on in the living room to a low volume, as it had been the night Peter fell asleep on the couch and Manu was later murdered. And the ranger in the master bedroom shouted and yelled and made all this noise, and the ranger in the living room could not hear a thing. That's how poorly sound traveled in the Allen household, which is a big reason why nobody heard what was going on in the master bedroom. And also, Kiara, when she had fallen asleep, she had her earbuds in, which did already degrade her ability to hear what was going on in the house, and Darian really had been upstairs with headphones on, which also affected his ability to hear what was going on in the house. So really, nobody heard anything. As for the knife that was found in the bedroom, it was determined to have not been the murder weapon. The knife that was used to kill Manu was found in Julius's backpack. And Peter's stolen communist block pistol was found in the home of Corey Taylor, Julius's friend, but Corey was found to not have been involved with the murder at all. Julius would eventually come clean and would admit that Peter actually had nothing to do with the murder and that Julius had acted totally alone. And it would turn out Peter's theory about the murder, the idea that somebody had maybe tried to break in to steal his guns, but then inadvertently killed his wife, seemed to be at least partially right. Julius claimed when he snuck into the house, he was looking to steal Peter's guns. Julius said he was in the process of stealing an unsecured gun from a cabinet in the master bedroom when Manu woke up. And he said his fight-or-flight response kicked in, and it led him to stab her 47 times and then strangle her, and then eventually later on also shoot her in the face post-mortem. Julius Mullins, who was 18 years old, pled guilty and was ultimately sentenced to 55 years in prison.
The night is folding softly in my hands, another chapter drifting with the sand. I've carried echoes heavier than stone, but every dawn reminds me I'm not alone. The wind begins to whisper where to go, and suddenly the past feels lighter than before. We're leaving footprints on tomorrow, stepping out from all the sorrow, running.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen's Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is